So we're going to look at T.S. Eliot's Love Song of Jail for Proofrock first because it's just an awesome poem, just an amazing poem. And second, because it's an example of what's going to later become called high modernism, as opposed to vernacular or low modernism. And these two ideas about poetry and culture are going to be laid out for us by T.S. Eliot and in dialogue with William Carlos Williams. At least that's how we're going to present it. But they both represent larger cultural movements and strands that I think endure in how we see culture right up to the current day. So we're going to start with Eliot, and then we're going to move on and look at William Carlos Williams in another presentation. And comparing the two, get a sense of this major tension about art in American culture. So a couple of things about Eliot. One thing that people are often surprised by is that Eliot, there's some debate about whether he should be taught in American lit or British lit, and the reality is he ends up being taught in both because he spends most of his adult life in England. He grows up in the United States and attends Harvard, where he drafts in 1910, 1911 the poem that we're going to study, the Love Song of Jail for Proofrock, although he's going to work on it and revise it for many years until it's published in 1917. In 1920, he publishes his famous poem, The Wasteland, which is this incredibly complex and rich poem where in many cases the notes that he provided to understand all the cultural allusions are longer than the actual poem itself. In the early 20s and really for the rest of his life, he also begins a career as an influential literary critic who articulates what within a modernist lens are very sort of traditional conservative ideas about literature. And much of his thinking will become the bulwark of what later becomes known as New Criticism or New Critical Theory. In 1948, he wins the Nobel Prize for the collected poetry of his career, and he dies in the mid-60s, notably before all hell breaks loose in terms of the disintegration of the Vietnam War and the Cultural Revolution and racial tensions and explosions of late 60s, early 70s America. So that's a little bit about his biography. I said before that he was traditional, that he was conservative, that in particularly later in his life after he converts to Anglicanism, he becomes pretty religious. But he also is the archetypal modernist. He's deeply invested in exploring the sense of alienation and disconnection created by modernity in our lives. And he sees at the center of that, like Faulkner, who in many ways is a parallel modernist, but of the American novel, he focuses on this human experience of fragmentation and isolation and disconnection. And like Faulkner, he's involved in social protest. Although Eliot's world is deeply different than Faulkner's. It's not the Deep South, it's urban Europe, it's urban America. And he's very powerfully disturbed by urbanization and urban life in Europe and America, and much of his work is involved in critiquing and questioning that. But also, like many modernist writers, Eliot is experimental and sophisticated. None of his work is an easy read. You want to have your handy-dandy link to the Oxford English Dictionary available at all times. Although in our case, the people of the Genius website have done the annotation and the explanation and the explanatory notes for us. But his poems are very elusive and tend to embrace what he would later be criticized for as sort of an elevated intellectual formalist vocabulary. And that brings us to the concept of high modernism. Unlike other modernist poets in America that we're going to be talking about, particularly William Carlos Williams, but also many others, Eliot is very interested in placing his poetry in the great arc and tradition of Western civilization and culture. He wants to trace a trajectory from the great Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, through the great Roman Aeneid and Virgil, Dante's Inferno, Shakespeare, up into the 20th century. So he wants to fit in that great literary tradition and see his work as advancing that literary tradition in some way, or in dialogue with these great networks of cultural allusions and referentiality, everything from the Bible to Hamlet to Dante's Inferno. So the complex cultural allusions are very important, and that's why it's important to use the website I gave you for the poem, because it unpacks a lot of those allusions for you, which may be unfamiliar. I already mentioned the elevated language, the diction, the choice of the formal over the informal, the choice of the intellectual register over the folk register or the vernacular voice. And then it's important to understand Eliot as very self-consciously taking imagism to the next level. And one way he does that is by articulating this idea of the objective correlative. And the idea of the objective correlative, in a way, is sort of absurd, but it gets at the notion of language that lurks beneath Eliot's poetry. Eliot argued that the objective correlative is a set of objects, a situation, or a chain of events. We can think of those in a poem as images that are the formula for evoking a particular emotion. So I can show you a pair of ragged claws scuttling across the deep blue sea or the floor of the ocean sea, and that should provoke in you a specific psychological or emotional response. So this gives the artist tremendous power in terms of what she or he can create via language. But it also means that every word is richly imbued with meaning and interpretive possibility, but ultimately that there is a correct interpretation to be found. So unlike many of the postmodern kind of writers and thinkers that we've been looking at, say Toni Morrison in Song of Solomon, Eliot is of the traditional school that there is a transcendent truth out there. There is a meaning behind the poem. There is a set of emotions and psychological responses that a particular set of correctly manipulated, presented words can evoke. Now, that is a pretty rigorous idea and a pretty idealistic one. And we know that readers are going to respond in different ways to language. But Eliot believed that the reader needed to push past the reader's own experience in biography and the writer's own experience in biography and get to these truths that language could take us to. Truths of human experience stimulated by language. So this is a very static notion of language. Language is rich, but there are limits to its meanings. And so this becomes the core of a school of literary criticism called New Criticism that emphasizes closely reading poems and literature to unpack the ironies and ambiguities and maneuvers of diction and rhetoric to uncover the truth, to uncover the beautiful meaning, insight lurking behind a poem. It's there if you just work hard enough to find it and carefully dissect the language. It's almost like a scientific view of language and poetry. But of course, it isn't ultimately, because it's connecting language to emotion and psychology, which of course are unstable reference in and of themselves. So this is kind of an interesting idea to think about as you read Proofrock. A couple last ideas about reading Proofrock. First of all, let go of the idea that you're going to find a story or a narrative in the poem. Think instead of a slideshow. You're sitting in a room and there's a man talking to you and images are popping up on the slide. And you are left to respond emotionally and psychologically to those images and try to understand the feeling that this narrator, speaker, is trying to communicate to you. Culturally, the anxiety and alienation of the poem is very much a manifestation of early 20th century America. He starts writing the poem in the pre-World War I era. He publishes it during World War I. This is a poem deeply invested in what's happening in America and Europe, and the sense of despair and dislocation and disillusionment of the time period. Another important thing about reading Proofrock is to look for motifs or patterns of related images. I'm going to list a few here, and I'm going to urge you to have this list open as you read the poem and work through the Genius Site's beautiful annotations of the language. Look for the motif of urban grime and the protest of the dirtiness and the claustrophobia of urban life. Look for images related to personal and emotional and psychological disconnection. Proofrock is disconnected from himself and others. And at the core is this idea of self-loathing. This is a man who is alienated by his world and has come to despise and doubt and loathe himself. And so many of the images connect to that idea of self-loathing. There's also a sustained pattern of sexual anxiety, which is connected to the question of emotional and psychological disconnection. So there are a lot of images and references to sexuality and sexual experiences in the poem. There's also a real interest in liminality. We start off with the early line of like a patient etherized on a table. You're neither conscious or unconscious. You're neither present or absent. You're in this middle space, and that challenges and complicates binaries that we rely on for our ability to find truth, right, and assess truth and understand ourselves. And then another really interesting pattern is images that critique the sterility of bourgeois culture and life in Europe and America. That sort of phony upper middle to upper class elitism that isn't real, that's not connected to authentic engagement with beauty and art and meaning, but is more about status and psychological and sexual and social anxiety. So see what you can do to unpack those key motifs and see what you can find as you read the poem. It really is an amazingly rich text. See you out in Blackboard.